Many centuries ago, in towns across Europe and Asia, there were people who worked as night soil collectors. Their job was simple to describe but hard to do. They gathered human waste from homes, streets, and public places. At a time before modern plumbing, this job was necessary for clean towns and healthy families. But it was also one of the most disliked jobs in daily life. These workers often went out at night. They carried large buckets or pushed carts. They opened small doors that led to outdoor toilets or containers behind houses. They emptied what had built up during the day. The smell was strong, the work was messy, and the hours were long. Still, people chose to do it. Many took the job because it paid better than other options for poor workers. Some took pride in helping keep their community clean. Others simply had no other way to earn money for food and shelter. Life for these workers was quiet and disciplined. They learned how to move through dark streets without disturbing sleeping neighbors. They learned how to keep their tools clean enough to use again. They understood the risks of sickness, but they also knew that towns needed them. In many old towns, night soil collectors had a clear routine. Their work usually began after sunset. Streets were quieter at that time. People were already indoors. Shops had closed. The workers preferred these hours because their task drew less attention. They could move slowly through narrow lanes without feeling watched or judged. Some towns even had rules that forced them to work at night, so the smell and noise would not affect daily business hours. A worker often began by checking his tools. These tools were simple. There was the main bucket, usually made of wood or metal. There was a lid to help contain smells. There was a carrying pole, which helped balance the heavy load across the shoulders. Some places used carts with wheels. Some used sled, like boards that slid over dirt roads. Workers also carried small scrapers or brushes to clean surfaces. They kept cloths for wiping hands and faces. There were no gloves or protective masks like we have today. Workers had to make do with basic equipment. Before leaving home, many workers covered their clothes with extra layers. They wore old shirts and trousers so that their better clothing would stay clean for daytime. Some tied cloth around their nose and mouth. Others did not, because they said it only made breathing harder. Still, each worker had a method that made the task a bit more bearable. A night soil collector walked from house to house. In many towns, each home had a container or pit. The family paid a small fee to have it emptied. Some families could not pay much, so the workers allowed them to pay less. Other families paid extra, so the worker would come more often. Payments were sometimes made in money, but often they were made in food or goods. A worker might receive a loaf of bread, a jug of milk, or some vegetables. These small gifts helped them return home with something to share with their family. Some towns had strict systems. They assigned each worker a route and kept records of who emptied which containers. Other towns were more relaxed. Workers simply made their own paths and served regular customers. In busy cities, workers formed groups. They helped each other carry heavy loads. They worked in shifts. If a worker fell sick or could not keep up, another worker took over for a small share of the payment. Night soil collectors learned to move carefully. Roads were uneven. Some streets had stones that stuck up. Others had deep mud when it rained. In colder places, winter brought icy paths. Carrying heavy buckets on slippery ground was dangerous. A worker who slipped could spill the bucket, and then he had to clean both himself and the street. This made the job even longer and more difficult. Because of these risks, workers stepped slowly, checked their footing, and leaned forward while carrying loads. Workers also had to be alert for animals. In some regions, stray dogs followed them. The smell attracted the animals, which sometimes got too close. In other places, rats were a common problem. Workers tapped their poles on the ground to scare them away. They also kept an eye on horses that passed by. A worker with a heavy load could not move quickly, so he had to be ready when a horse-drawn cart came down a narrow street. In certain cities, night soil collectors faced social challenges. Many people looked down on them because of the nature of their job. The smell made others avoid standing near them. Some refused to greet them. Some even made jokes at their expense. For this reason, many collectors walked with their heads lowered. They tried to finish their work without drawing attention. Yet despite this, some families treated them kindly. They greeted the workers with respect. They offered warm food on cold nights. They understood the importance of the job and knew that without these workers, their homes would be less healthy. Across many regions, night soil collectors became part of the town's rhythm. They were the quiet workers who helped keep diseases from spreading. Before modern sanitation, waste was a major health risk. If it was left in streets or near wells, it could seep into water sources and cause sickness. Workers understood this, even if no one thanked them. They knew their work helped keep neighbors safe. Many workers took quiet pride in this sense of purpose. They could not see germs, but they observed patterns. They saw that towns with regular collection had fewer outbreaks of disease. They saw that families who kept their pits cleaner were less often ill. In some places, the collected waste had value. Farmers used it as fertilizer. They mixed it with straw or soil to make it safer and more useful. The night, soil collectors delivered their loads to special areas outside the town. There, workers dumped the waste into large pits. Over time, the waste broke down and became easier to handle. Some regions sold this fertilizer to farmers. This created a small economy around the work. Even though the job was dirty, it connected towns to farms and helped with food production. Because the waste had use, some city officials supported the workers. They set rules to keep the process orderly. For example, some cities required collectors to visit certain homes on certain days. Others set fixed prices so families could not be overcharged. Some towns built designated storage pits that workers could access easily. A few cities even had early sewer channels, simple ditches or covered drains that helped move waste away from populated areas. But even in places with these channels, workers were still needed because drains often clogged or only served certain parts of the town. Over time, workers developed small skills that made the job easier. They learned how to lift heavy buckets in a safe way that reduced strain on their backs. They learned how to divide loads evenly across the carrying pole. so it did not swing too much. They learned the best times to visit certain areas. In wealthy neighborhoods, residents often wanted collection done before sunrise. In crowded areas, workers waited until people were asleep to avoid complaints. Workers also memorized which homes had deep pits and which had shallow ones. They remembered which homes had loose doors or noisy hinges. Some workers brought small lamps or candles. Many streets had no lights, so workers had to rely on these small sources of light to see where they stepped. Lamps also helped them see pit openings clearly. A simple mistake, like stepping in the wrong direction, could lead to injury. For this reason, workers checked their lamps often, making sure the flame stayed steady as they moved. Because the job was tiring, workers took short breaks. They found quiet corners where no one would notice them. There they rested their arms and backs. Some sat on low walls or stone steps. Others leaned their buckets against a building and stretched their shoulders. Since the smell of the job stayed around them, they usually kept distance from others during these breaks. Many workers learned mental techniques to stay calm. They focused on breathing slowly. They focused on each small step of the process. They tried not to rush, because rushing made mistakes more likely. Families of night, soil collectors had mixed feelings about the job. They were grateful for the income, but they knew it was not respected by others. Children sometimes felt embarrassed to tell classmates what their parents did, but many families supported each other with strong bonds. They understood that someone had to do the work, and they were proud of their effort to survive. In some families, the job passed down from parent to child. This happened because families already had the tools and knew the routine. It also happened because the job was always needed, so it provided steady employment even during difficult times. In other cases, the job was temporary. A worker might do it during a period of hardship, and then move on to something else once opportunities improved. But even those who left the job remembered how demanding it had been. They often carried lifelong respect for anyone who still worked as a collector. The daily schedule of a typical worker was very steady. After finishing a long night, the worker returned home near sunrise. He cleaned his tools first, washing them with water from a well or river. This step was important because dried waste made the buckets heavier and caused odors to linger. Cleaning the tools took time, but it made the next night easier. Some workers used ashes or sand to scrub surfaces. Others used pieces of cloth that were later burned or thrown away. After the tools were clean, the worker washed himself. Soap was often simple and rough. Water was cold, but these small steps helped him feel more comfortable. Some workers took short naps during the day because the night shift left them tired. Others did extra daytime work, such as sweeping streets, mending clothes, or helping at markets. Many families needed multiple sources of income, so a night soil collector rarely had full rest. In some regions, night soil collectors faced legal restrictions. They were not allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. They were required to use specific paths when moving through the town. These rules were based on fears about disease and smell. Though these restrictions made life harder, workers learned to navigate them. They formed small communities among themselves. They looked out for each other. When one worker got injured or sick, others stepped in to help with the root. The job also changed over time. As towns grew larger, the amount of waste increased. The workers had to make more trips to disposal areas. Some cities introduced wheeled carts to make transportation easier. Others built early sewer networks, though these systems were often incomplete and still required workers to maintain them. Collectors learned new methods as cities changed their laws. Some towns demanded more frequent collection to reduce odors. Other towns required workers to wear certain clothing or badges. In some cultures, night soil collectors were treated with more respect. In East Asia, for example, farmers valued human waste as fertilizer. Collectors were seen as part of the agricultural cycle. They played a clear role in turning waste into something useful for growing crops. This made the job somewhat more respected, though still difficult. In Japan, workers developed techniques to ferment or treat waste before selling it to farmers. In China, waste was stored in special containers to reduce smell and improve safety before use on fields. These systems encouraged more organized collection routines. In Europe, night soil collectors faced greater social stigma. Many people wanted nothing to do with the job. Some towns tried to hide the workers from public view, but the workers remained essential. They prevented waste from piling up in alleys. They reduced the spread of diseases like cholera and dysentery, even though people at the time did not fully understand how these illnesses spread. Over centuries, as plumbing technology improved, the role of night soil collectors slowly changed. Early sewers carried waste away using flowing water, but these systems were expensive and took decades to build. Some towns began with simple pipes that connected public buildings. Homes were added later. During this long transition, night soil collectors still had to empty pits and clean areas that pipes did not reach. This period of overlap lasted many years. Even in cities that installed sewers, workers were still needed to check drains and remove blockages. As sanitation systems grew more advanced, fewer people entered the job. Wages dropped in some places. In others, wages rose because there were not enough willing workers. Governments slowly introduced laws that improved public health. They encouraged families to install toilets that connected to sewers. This reduced the need for manual collection. But in rural areas and in poorer neighborhoods, night soil collectors continued their work well into the 20th century. In some parts of the world, night soil collection remained common until very recently. In these areas, workers faced health risks from contact with waste. They also faced social challenges. Many reform groups tried to improve conditions. Some provided protective gear. Others pushed for better sanitation systems so that workers would no longer need to do the job. These efforts helped reduce the number of people who relied on night soil collection as a primary source of income. When looking back on this job, historians note its importance. Without night soil collectors, towns would have struggled with serious health problems. Streets would have been dirtier. Wells and rivers would have been at greater risk of contamination. Workers did a job that most people preferred to ignore, yet it supported daily life in ways that few recognized. Their work was part of the unseen structure that allowed communities to grow and survive. The history of this job teaches us about how societies adapt. Before modern tools existed, people had to solve problems in simple ways. They relied on human effort. They learned to accept uncomfortable tasks because those tasks kept everyone safe. The story of night soil collectors is not glamorous. It does not involve grand battles or famous leaders. But it is a reminder that ordinary workers played crucial roles in shaping daily life. Thinking about these workers can also help us appreciate modern sanitation. Many people today take clean bathrooms, sewer systems, and waste treatment plants for granted. They may not realize how hard life was before such systems existed. Night soil collectors lived through those conditions every day. They faced smells, physical strain, and social challenges. Yet they continued their job because they understood its value. Their story also shows how people can find purpose in difficult tasks. Even though the job was unpleasant, many collectors felt they were doing something useful. They helped protect their families and neighbors. They helped keep towns functioning. They worked quietly through the night while others slept, carrying loads that no one else wished to handle. Today, the job has changed. Machines now handle most waste removal. Workers who maintain modern sanitation systems have better tools and protective equipment. But their work is still essential. They continue a long tradition of keeping towns clean and safe. Looking back, it is clear that night, soil collectors performed one of the hardest everyday jobs in history. Yet people still did it because it offered steady income, filled an important need, and supported the health of entire communities. Their story is simple, steady, and real. It reminds us that history is built on the efforts of ordinary people doing necessary tasks, even when those tasks are tiring and uncomfortable. This quiet work, done over many centuries, helped create the cleaner and healthier world we know today. As towns continued to grow, night soil collectors found their work changing in quiet but important ways. More people meant more homes, and more homes meant more waste to remove. In many places, the collectors had to expand their routes. Streets that were once short became longer. Areas that had been open fields became crowded neighborhoods. Workers learned these new paths and added them to their nightly routine. They moved at the same slow pace, but their nights became longer. Some collectors worked alone. Others worked with partners. When two workers carried a large container together, the weight was easier to manage. They also kept each other company during long hours. Conversations were simple. They often talked about the weather, family matters, or small events they had heard in town. Partners shared tips about avoiding certain corners where the ground was soft or where water gathered after rain. In this way, the job created small communities among the workers themselves. In larger towns, night soil collection sometimes became organized under a single official or foreman. This person kept records, assigned routes, and collected payments from households. He then shared the money with the workers. This system helped keep the work more stable, though it also added rules. Workers now had to follow strict schedules and could not choose their routes freely. Still, many accepted these changes because it meant they had a guaranteed area to work in and fewer conflicts with other workers. The tools used in the job slowly became better over time. Wooden buckets were replaced with metal buckets in some regions. Metal was easier to clean and did not absorb smells the way wood did. Some workers began using scoops that were shaped more carefully, which allowed them to work more quickly. When carts improved, workers could carry more waste in a single trip. These changes made the work a bit easier, but the core of the job remained the same. Waste still had to be collected by hand, carried through the streets, and taken to the disposal area. In many towns, the disposal area was located outside the walls. Workers had to walk long distances to reach these sites. At night, the path could be dark and quiet. Workers relied on simple lanterns, which did not shine very far. Sometimes they walked down narrow dirt roads lined with trees. In the distance, they might hear the sound of animals or the wind. These long walks gave workers time to think. Some thought about their families sleeping at home. Others thought about the next part of their route. Some simply focused on putting one foot in front of the other. At the disposal site, workers emptied their loads into large pits. These pits were dug deep and wide. Over time, the waste broke down. In many places, workers covered the waste with dirt or straw to control the smell and reduce flies. This part of the job also required care. Workers had to be sure not to step too close to the edge of a pit. The soil could be soft, and a misstep could cause the ground to give way. For this reason, workers developed routines for approaching the pit safely. They set down their buckets in specific places. They emptied them slowly and steadily. When the waste was used as fertilizer, workers felt a quiet sense of usefulness. They knew the waste would help grow crops. They knew families in the town would later buy the food grown in those fields. This connection between town and countryside gave the job a practical purpose. Even though most people did not think about this process, workers understood it well. Night soil collectors also faced health risks. They were often exposed to germs, even though people at the time did not understand germs in a modern way. The workers noticed that some illnesses spread more easily in areas where waste was not collected regularly. They noticed that clean pits resulted in healthier families. Even without full scientific knowledge, they understood the basic patterns of sickness. Workers tried to protect themselves by washing as well as they could. But washing was difficult. Water sources were not always close. In winter, the water was very cold. Soap was simple and not always available. Still, workers did what they could. They washed their hands, tools, and clothing. Some workers washed their faces before eating. These small habits helped reduce health risks, even though workers did not fully know why. Some night soil collectors developed strong endurance. The job required constant lifting, walking, and balancing. Workers formed steady muscles over time. Their bodies adapted to the demands of the job, but the job also caused strain. Many workers had back pain, sore shoulders, and stiff joints. They did not have access to modern medical care. When a worker became injured, he often kept working because he needed the money. Families depended on the income, no matter how difficult the work had become. Despite these challenges, some workers remained in the job for decades. They learned every corner of the town. They remembered households that had moved away and families that had grown. They noticed changes in buildings, street layouts, and local habits. Over time, they became quiet observers of the town's growth. Their work gave them a slow view of history unfolding around them. Sometimes, workers faced obstacles that had nothing to do with the waste itself. For example, they had to deal with locked gates or blocked paths. Some households forgot to leave their small access doors open. When this happened, the workers had to knock or return later. They could not simply leave the job undone, because this would cause problems for the household and for the town. A missed collection meant the pit could overflow, which created a health risk. In some towns, people left small lanterns near their pits to help the workers see. This was a sign of respect. It showed that families recognized how hard the job was. In other places, households left water nearby so the workers could quickly rinse tools. These small signs of kindness meant a great deal to the workers. They made the long nights feel a bit less lonely. Night soil collectors often saw parts of the town that most people rarely visited. In some places, they passed through alleys behind homes. In others, they walked behind shops or along the backs of markets. They saw the quiet side of busy places. During the day, these areas were loud and full of activity, but at night, they were peaceful. Workers heard only the sound of their footsteps, their breathing, and their tools. When major events happened in the town, such as fairs, festivals, or market days, night soil collectors often had extra work. More visitors meant more waste in public areas. Workers had to empty temporary containers and clean more spaces. These tasks made their nights longer and more tiring. But the extra work sometimes brought extra payment, which helped their families. In some cities, workers became familiar figures. People recognized them even if they did not speak to them. They were the silent helpers who walked through the night while others rested. Some workers kept the same schedule for so many years that neighbors knew exactly when they would pass by. This regular pattern brought a sense of order to the town. When sewer systems slowly improved, workers watched the change with mixed feelings. Some welcomed the new technology. They hoped it would make towns cleaner and reduce disease. Others worried about losing their jobs. They had done this work for so long that it felt strange to imagine life without it. Many workers were unsure whether they would be able to find new jobs. They wondered how they would support their families in a changing world. In some cities, workers were offered new roles. They became sewer cleaners or drain inspectors. These jobs had different risks, but also used some of the same skills. Workers who had spent years walking the town at night were often accustomed to quiet and careful work. They knew how to move safely in low light. They knew how to work in narrow spaces. These traits were useful for early sewer maintenance jobs. In other places, however, workers received no support when their old job disappeared. They had to find new work on their own. Some became laborers at markets. Others worked in construction. Some became porters who carried goods around town. These new jobs were hard, but familiar in the sense that they still relied on physical strength. The slow disappearance of night soil collecting shows how history moves forward in ways that affect ordinary people. New technology often brings improvements, but it also changes the lives of workers who depended on older systems. For night soil collectors, This transition took many decades. There was no single day when the job ended. Instead, the job became smaller and smaller as more homes connected to sewers. In rural areas, however, the job remained common for a long time. Farms continued to use human waste as fertilizer. Collectors kept traveling between villages and fields. Their tools and routines changed only slowly. Even when towns installed sewer systems, farmers still valued waste as a resource. This kept the job alive for many years longer in countryside areas. Throughout all this history, the job remained grounded in simple, steady routines. Every night, workers lifted, carried, and emptied. Every morning, they cleaned their tools and rested for the day ahead. They did not seek fame or recognition. Their work was practical. It solved a necessary problem. Historians today study these workers because their story gives insight into everyday life before modern sanitation. Their job reveals what people had to do to keep towns clean. It shows the effort required to manage waste safely. It shows how important manual labor was in times before technology took over many tasks. Their story also reminds us of the human strength that comes from doing difficult work with patience and discipline. Night soil collectors rarely had luxury or comfort, but they continued their work night after night, the knowing that families depended on them. They accepted the smell, the physical strain, and the long hours. They found ways to cope with the challenges. They formed communities, shared advice, and helped one another. In many ways, their work helped shape the early steps toward modern sanitation. Without the routines they followed, towns would have struggled with waste. Without their careful movement through the streets, pits would have overflowed. Without their steady efforts, health problems would have been worse. This connection between their daily tasks and the wider well-being of the town makes their role meaningful. Even though the job no longer exists in most parts of the world today, its history remains important. It teaches us what life was like for ordinary people. It shows how hard work can quietly support entire communities. And it gives us a deeper appreciation for the systems that now keep our towns clean with far less effort. The story of Night Soil Collectors is not dramatic. It has no grand scenes. It has no famous invented characters. It is simply the honest story of workers who did a hard job because someone had to do it. Their nights were long. Their loads were heavy. Their work was unrecognized. But their contribution was real. Their story continues to remind us that history is not only shaped by rulers or inventors. It is shaped also by the steady hands of workers who face difficulty with quiet determination. This calm and steady way of life, repeated across centuries, forms an important part of the past. As time went on, many towns began to think more seriously about public health. Officials noticed that clean streets and proper waste removal helped reduce sickness. They did not understand germs in the modern scientific way, but they saw that patterns changed when waste was handled more carefully. Because of this, some towns started to organize night soil collection more strictly. Workers were given clearer instructions. Routes were mapped out. Disposal areas were expanded. Simple rules were made to guide the work. These rules did not remove the difficulty of the job, but they made its purpose more widely recognized. Households were reminded to maintain access points so workers could reach pits easily. Public notices advised families to empty their containers on regular schedules. Some towns placed lids on public latrines to reduce smell and flies. Night soil collectors noticed these changes. They felt slightly more supported, even if the job remained demanding. In many places, workers continued to begin their nights in the same way. They prepared their tools, made sure their buckets were secure, and tied cloth around their clothing. Some workers kept a routine of checking their shoulders for sores or marks left by the carrying pole. If they noticed soreness, they placed a thin cloth between the pole and their skin. This small step often made long nights more bearable. When workers reached each household, they followed simple steps. They lifted the container lid, emptied the waste into their main bucket, and checked to be sure the pit was left clean. Sometimes, they used small scrapers to remove any remaining waste stuck to the sides. Other times, they poured a bit of water to loosen the material. These actions were done slowly and carefully. Workers did not want to spill anything on themselves or on the ground. A single slip could cause extra work and wasted time. Many workers learned to move almost silently. They did not wish to wake sleeping families. Wooden doors creaked easily, so workers learned how to lift them gently. Metal hinges clanked loudly, so workers opened them in small, slow motions. These quiet habits became second nature. If a worker trained a younger family member for the job, this was one of the first skills taught: move slowly, do not rush, keep the noise low. In larger cities, workers began to carry simple forms of identification, often issued by local officials. This allowed households to know which worker was responsible for their rote. It also prevented disputes between workers over who was allowed to empty certain pits. Although the job was not respected, it still provided a living, and workers needed protection from unfair competition. These small forms of identification helped keep order. Night soil collectors also had to be aware of the weather. Rain made the ground soft. Mud slowed the workers. Their boots became heavy. Carts sometimes stuck in deep soil. Workers knew which paths drained well and which paths flooded easily. In snowy climates, winter brought several new problems. Snow covered holes in the road. Ice made carrying loads dangerous. Workers sometimes spread ashes or sand in front of them to improve their footing. They did these tasks quietly, because shouting or calling for help might disturb people in their sleep. In warmer climates, heat brought a different problem. Waste gave off stronger smells during hot months. Workers often tried to finish their routes before the hottest part of the night, but sometimes the workload did not allow this. On those nights, workers drank extra water and tried to rest in shaded corners. If they had cloth coverings, they sometimes soaked them to stay cooler. Despite the challenges, workers found small ways to make their nights easier. Some formed partnerships, where one worker lifted the bucket while the other steadied the carrying pole. Some agreed to rest together at the same time so they could share stories and stay awake. Others developed habits like counting the number of households visited or marking small notches on their pole to track progress. These routines gave structure to the long hours. In many regions, Night, soil collectors lived in simple houses near the outer parts of town. These areas were usually cheaper and closer to the disposal sites. Living nearby helped reduce travel time at the start and end of each shift. Although these neighborhoods were not wealthy, they had strong bonds. Workers' families supported one another. Children played together. Women shared small tasks, like washing clothes at wells or preparing food. Even though outsiders often avoided these neighborhoods, the people within them formed close communities. Children of night, soil collectors, grew up watching their parents leave home each night. They saw the tools prepared and cleaned. They heard stories about difficult paths or long nights. Some children later took up the job themselves. Others looked for different forms of work, but they still remembered the steady routine they had witnessed since childhood. Many children respected the patience and strength of their parents, even though they knew the job was hard. Workers sometimes spoke quietly about their hopes for the future. Some wished for lighter tools. Some wished for better wages. Others wished for shorter routes. But many simply wished for their children to have easier lives. They hoped that their families would someday have cleaner water, safer housing, and more choices for work. As modern ideas about sanitation grew stronger, towns began to hire engineers to study waste systems. These engineers observed the routes used by night soil collectors. They measured distances between houses and disposal areas. They noted which parts of the town produced the most waste. In some places, these studies led to plans for underground sewer pipes. Workers watched these early plans with curiosity. They wondered how long such systems would take to build. They knew that, for many years, their job would still be needed. The arrival of new technology did not end the job immediately. Early sewers often served only main streets or new buildings. Older homes still relied on pits. The narrow alleys remained unchanged for years. Workers continued their routes, even as new pipes were installed nearby. This period of change was long and uneven. Some workers carried loads past construction sites where pipes were being laid. They observed the workers installing bricks and channels. But their own work continued in much the same way. As towns grew wealthier, public discussions about dignity and working conditions became more common. Reformers argued that night soil collectors deserved better treatment. They said these workers performed essential tasks and should not be pushed to the edges of society. Some reformers organized efforts to provide gloves, aprons, or simple masks. Though these items were basic, they offered some protection that workers had not enjoyed before. In a few places, reform groups opened public baths where workers could wash more thoroughly after their shifts. These baths served many people, not just night soil collectors, but collectors made good use of them. Clean water and soap felt comforting after long nights of handling waste. Workers appreciated this simple support. Night soil collectors also witnessed changes in the way households managed their own waste. As knowledge of hygiene increased, families began to keep their pits cleaner. They added covers when possible. They tried to schedule collections more regularly. Some families even created small drainage channels that made pits easier to clean. These changes helped reduce the amount of time workers spent at each home. In some regions, the demand for fertilizer rose sharply. Farmers needed more nutrients for their growing fields. This increased the value of night soil. Collectors who could deliver waste reliably sometimes earned higher payments from farmers. This gave workers a small economic boost. It also encouraged some to organize more efficient transportation methods, such as using two wheel carts pulled by animals. These carts could carry several buckets at once, reducing the number of trips needed. Even with these improvements, the job was still physically demanding. A typical night required hours of continuous lifting. Workers had to stay alert to avoid accidents. They needed to maintain balance at all times. Simple injuries were common. A twisted ankle, a sore knee, or a strained shoulder could make work painful. Some workers used herbal remedies or warm cloths to ease pain. Families often helped with these small treatments. One of the most challenging parts of the job was the isolation. Workers spent many hours walking alone in the quiet dark. The only sounds might be distant dogs, cold wind, or the shifting of their buckets. Some workers grew accustomed to this silence and found it peaceful in its own way. Others found it tiring. To help, some workers developed routines of humming simple tunes or repeating calming phrases quietly to themselves. These habits helped them stay focused and steady. As cities continued to modernize, more public meetings were held to discuss sanitation. Officials reviewed budgets. Engineers proposed plans. Citizens gave opinions. Many times night soil collectors attended these meetings to listen. They rarely spoke, but they understood that the decisions made would affect their future. Some felt hopeful when they heard about better systems. Others felt unsure because change always brought uncertainty. When sewer systems expanded enough to replace most manual collection, many workers faced major life changes. Older workers often retired with limited savings. Younger workers looked for new jobs. Some found work maintaining the new sewer systems. These jobs required learning new tools and processes, but many workers adapted. They were already familiar with the general nature of sanitation work, and their experience helped them adjust. Workers who moved into sewer maintenance inspected tunnels, checked for blockages, and ensured that water flowed properly. Although the environment was still demanding, these jobs offered more stability and sometimes better pay. Other former collectors moved into street cleaning jobs, which involved sweeping roads and managing waste that accumulated in public areas. This work was less physically intense than carrying night soil buckets, and it allowed workers to stay above ground in daylight. In rural areas, however, night soil collection remained a steady part of life long after cities adopted sewer systems. Villages continued to use simple pits. Farmers continued to rely on waste as fertilizer. Families continued to call workers to empty their containers. In these regions, the traditions passed from one generation to the next with little change. Workers still walked long distances at night. They still carried loads on their shoulders. They still understood the value of their work in supporting agriculture. Eventually, even rural areas began to adopt newer sanitation systems. But this process took much longer. When it finally reached them, night soil collectors experienced the same transitions that had occurred earlier in towns. Some found new jobs in agriculture. Others became workers in small factories or shops as rural economies changed. Yet the history of their work remained with them. It shaped their physical strength, their habits, and their memories of quiet nights spent keeping their communities clean. Looking back, historians see that night, soil collectors played a vital role in preventing disease and maintaining order in early towns. Their work supported basic hygiene long before the science of sanitation became clear. Without their steady efforts, many towns would have faced greater health challenges. Their job may have been unpleasant, but it was important. Today, their history helps us understand how communities handled everyday problems in practical ways. It reminds us that progress does not happen suddenly. It builds slowly through many small tasks performed by ordinary people. Night soil collectors did not seek praise, but their work formed a foundation for the sanitation systems we rely on today. Their story is a quiet one, shaped by steady steps in the dark, simple tools, and careful routines. Yet it reflects the strength and patience of people who faced a difficult job and carried it out with discipline and endurance. Their history remains a valuable part of understanding how everyday life once worked and how it slowly changed into the systems we know now. As the night, soil workers moved through their routines. They learned the small patterns of the towns they served. They knew which homes filled their waste containers faster. They knew which alleys were narrow and needed extra care. They knew where loose stones could make a cart shake too much. They also knew where dogs slept, where cats hid, and where lanterns burned low. Their nights were quiet, steady, and careful. In many towns, these workers were part of a strict system. Some cities hired them directly. Other places allowed private groups to manage the work. In both cases, the job was organized in a way that kept the town's waste from building up. People in these roles followed clear paths and schedules. They passed the same streets again and again. It was slow work, but it kept the town safe. At the time, people did not yet understand germs the way we do today. They did know that bad smells were linked to sickness, even if they did not fully understand why. Because of this belief, the job of night, soil collection, was seen as important, but also risky. Many believed that being close to waste could harm a person's health. Some families did not want their children near workers who handled waste, even though these workers helped keep the whole community cleaner. The workers understood these feelings. They knew their job was unpleasant to think about. They were used to people stepping back when they passed. They were used to houses trying to keep distance from them. But they also knew the town would not last long without their labor. In crowded areas, waste could build up in only a few days. Rain could wash it into streets. Wells could become polluted. People could become sick. The workers accepted their place because someone had to do the job, and they had the skills to do it. Many of these workers came from families that had done this type of work for generations. In some regions, the job was linked to low social status. This placed the workers in a difficult position. They felt proud of their service, but they also felt the weight of society's judgment. Children born into these families often expected to join the same trade. They learned early how to lift buckets safely. They learned how to avoid spills. They learned how to clean their hands and clothes, as well as they could after each shift. In some parts of the world, such as Japan during certain historical periods, night soil was not only collected, but also sold as fertilizer. Farmers needed it for their fields. The waste was valuable because it helped crops grow. Because of this, the job carried a bit more respect in those areas. The work was still difficult, but the waste itself was part of an economic system that supported whole villages. Workers could make deals with farmers. Households could pay less if they allowed their waste to be collected for farming use. These agreements helped everyone, and the system stayed in place for many years. In other places, like medieval and early modern Europe, the work was less connected to farming and more about simple removal. Towns wanted to stay clean. Officials passed rules about where waste could be dumped and how it had to be carried out of the town walls. Some workers carried the waste in barrels. Others used carts pulled by small horses. Some carried poles with buckets balanced on each end. All methods required strength and care. During cold seasons, the work changed. Waste could freeze inside containers. Workers had to break it loose before lifting it out. This slowed them down and made the job even harder. During warm seasons, smells grew stronger, and insects became a problem. Workers used cloths over their noses and mouths. They washed their hands in basins of cold water placed around the town. They learned to move with patience, because rushing only caused spills. Many towns had special meeting points outside their walls. These were areas where the night soil could be dumped, buried, or processed. Some places built large pits that were covered after each drop-off. Others spread the waste across empty land far from homes. The location often depended on the size of the town and the rules of the local officials. Workers knew these sites well. Some spent much of their night walking back and forth between the homes they served and the disposal areas. The workers carried simple tools, scoops, shovels, buckets, ropes, brushes, and cloths. They kept their tools in sheds or small storage rooms placed around the town. They repaired them when they could. Wooden handles were smoothed with sand. Metal parts were scrubbed clean. Some workers carved marks into their tools to make sure they could tell them apart from others. Because their job was so difficult, workers often created their own routines to keep themselves steady. Some worked in pairs. One lifted, the other carried. Some moved alone, but kept a slow, even pace. Some chose to speak very little during their shift. Others hummed simple tunes to break the silence of the night. They rarely made loud sounds, because most of the town was asleep. People who woke early sometimes saw the workers finishing their routes. These early risers, such as bakers or stable hands, recognized the workers. They often gave them a simple nod. It was a quiet sign of respect from those who understood how important the work was. Even if the job was disliked, many ordinary workers in the town knew that the night soil collectors helped keep sickness away. Over time, towns grew larger. Streets became busier. Waste increased. In some cities, special teams were hired to clean streets during the day as well. But night, soil collectors still worked deep into the night. because their job required calm and darkness. As lights became more common in cities, workers used lanterns to see where they stepped. These lanterns hung from poles or hooks on their carts. The soft light guided them through narrow passages. In the 1800s, many cities began to build sewer systems. These systems slowly replaced the need for night soil collectors. But the change did not happen quickly. Some cities took decades to create underground tunnels. Many towns did not have enough money for such projects. Others were built on rocky ground that made digging difficult. For a long time, night soil workers and sewer builders worked side by side. One group handled the old system, while the other built the new. Even as sewer systems became more common, night soil collectors still played a role. Some rural communities kept using old methods because they were cheaper. Some cultures continued to use collected waste as fertilizer. Some towns had areas that were not yet connected to sewers. In these places, the old job stayed alive. During this period, health experts began to understand germs more clearly. They realized how waste carried bacteria that caused sickness. This new knowledge increased efforts to create safer systems. It also made people more aware of the risks faced by night soil workers. Officials in some areas began to provide basic protective equipment. Cloth masks became more common. Workers were encouraged to wash more often. Some towns gave them soap, which had previously been too expensive for many. Night, soil collectors continued their work with calm discipline. They had always known the job required caution. Even before the science was widely understood, they knew that staying clean helped them avoid sickness. They knew that slow, careful work protected both themselves and the town. As the 20th century arrived, sewer systems spread across much of the world. Many night soil workers moved on to other jobs. Some joined sanitation departments. Some became sewer maintenance workers. Others found work in factories or on farms. Their old job slowly became a memory of the past. Still, in some regions, the job continued much longer. In parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, access to modern plumbing developed slowly. Workers there kept the same routines that others had used centuries earlier. They carried buckets. They moved through dark streets. They kept towns and villages cleaner than they would have been otherwise. Today, in most places, the job no longer exists in its old form. Modern sanitation systems have replaced it, but the memory of night soil collection remains important. It reminds us that clean cities did not appear on their own. They were built by workers who were willing to do hard, unpleasant jobs so others could live in healthier conditions. Understanding this history also helps us appreciate the systems we have now. Clean water, drains, pipes, and treatment facilities all have a long story. That story includes many workers whose names we will never know. They worked during quiet nights, carrying heavy loads. They moved slowly with steady hands. They kept towns safe long before modern systems took over. Even though their job was often seen as the worst, the workers themselves stayed patient and calm. They learned how to manage discomfort and smell. They learned how to protect their health as best they could. They accepted that others might avoid them. They focused on completing their routes because they knew the community depended on them. Their story is simple, steady, and true. It shows how everyday work, even when unpleasant, can help shape the world in lasting ways. As night soil workers carried on with their tasks, they often noticed how each town changed from year to year. New houses appeared, old ones were repaired, streets were widened, markets grew. More people arrived from nearby villages. With each change, the amount of waste increased. Workers had to adjust their routes. They had to learn new paths and new stopping points. They kept track of these changes in their minds because most towns did not have written maps for sanitation. The workers simply learned by doing the job every night. In many places, workers formed small groups. These groups helped one another with the hardest parts of the job. For example, lifting full containers from large households could require 2 or 3 workers working together. They would position themselves on each side, lift at the same time, and move slowly toward the cart or the disposal area. Working as a group reduced accidents and made the job feel less lonely. Some workers created simple systems to support one another. They agreed on meeting points during the night. They shared water when needed. If one worker became sick or injured, others covered part of their route. This helped keep the town clean, even when someone could not work. These small acts of cooperation helped them stay steady during difficult nights. Because they worked while others slept, night soil collectors often had different daily rhythms than the rest of the town. Many returned home just as the sky began to lighten. They washed as well as they could. Some used basins of warm water if their household could heat water. Others used cold water from wells or rivers. They washed their hands, arms, and faces carefully. They washed their tools. They hung their clothes outside to dry and air out. After this, they ate simple meals and rested through the morning. Their families understood the demands of the job. Children learned not to disturb a resting parent who had worked all night. Partners in the household often took care of daytime tasks. They went to markets, fetched water, cooked food, and managed daily chores. This allowed the night soil workers to sleep long enough to return to work again after sunset. Some workers used their afternoon hours to make repairs. They fixed wooden handles that had cracked during the night. They checked their carts for damage from rough stones or heavy loads. They cleaned metal parts to reduce wear. These small moments of maintenance kept their tools working longer and made their jobs safer. In larger towns, night soil work sometimes connected to other services. For example, some workers were also responsible for removing trash or animal remains from streets. They gathered broken pottery, leftover food, straw, and anything else that could attract pests. This made their role even more important. They helped limit rats and other animals that spread disease. The town's overall health depended heavily on sanitation, even if people did not fully understand the causes of illness at the time. Over centuries, some regions developed more structured rules. Officials began to assign specific districts to workers. Some required the workers to wear simple badges or markers so that townspeople knew they were part of an official service. These markers were not symbols of pride, but they did help the workers move through streets without being questioned. Although the job remained difficult, some workers found small ways to make their nights more comfortable. For example, some tied cloth around their shoulders to reduce strain when carrying heavy loads. Others added padding to their tools. Some made their own gloves out of simple cloth, which helped protect their hands. These small improvements made long nights a little easier. Night soil workers also learned important skills by necessity. They learned how to move quietly. They learned how to judge weight just by lifting a container. They learned how to stay balanced on slippery cobblestones. They learned how to avoid spills when turning corners. They learned how to spot cracks in wooden buckets before they broke. Their experience came from doing these tasks again and again. In many cultures, the work was tied to social class or caste. This created challenges for workers and their families. Some people refused to interact closely with anyone who handled waste. Workers were sometimes prevented from taking part in certain community events. They were allowed in markets, but many shops kept distance. Some workers accepted this without complaint. Others felt sadness about being separated from the larger community. Still, they continued their work because the town needed them. During epidemics, the job became even more important. When sickness spread, people worried about cleanliness. Officials tightened rules about where waste could be dumped. Workers were asked to remove waste more often. Sometimes they worked longer hours during these times, even though they themselves faced higher risk. They understood that sickness often worsened when waste built up. They moved through their routes with extra care. In some cities, new inventions appeared that helped the job. For example, stronger metal buckets replaced wooden ones in certain regions. Handcarts with better wheels made transport easier. Simple lamps became brighter, helping workers see better at night. None of these changes removed the hard parts of the job, but they made the work a little safer and more predictable. Farmers who relied on night soil were especially thankful for the workers. They knew that the fertilizer improved their harvests. They paid the workers with rice, vegetables, or small amounts of money. These relationships between night, soil collectors, and farmers helped support rural communities. In some places, this partnership lasted for hundreds of years. As the world entered the late 19th and early 20th centuries, new ideas about public health began to spread. Governments invested more money in sanitation. Engineers planned sewer lines. Architects designed buildings with better drainage. Towns hired trained sanitation officers. Step by step, the role of night soil workers changed. Some workers were offered training so they could transition to sewer maintenance. These new roles still involved dealing with waste, but the work took place underground in enclosed systems. Although it remained difficult and sometimes dangerous, many workers welcomed these changes. They saw it as progress. It gave them more stability and sometimes more respect. In many growing cities, older neighborhoods still needed night soil collection, while newer areas used sewer systems. Workers found themselves moving between old methods and new approaches. This period of overlap sometimes lasted many years. During this time, workers developed new routines. They balanced their nights between traditional routes and tasks that supported modern sanitation projects. Slowly, the old job faded in most of the industrialized world. By the mid-20th century, only small pockets of night soil collection remained in those regions. But in less developed areas, the work continued longer. Some communities did not yet have the resources for deep sewer systems. Others relied on traditional farming methods that still depended on collected waste. Even in these places, changes eventually arrived. Governments built new infrastructure. International health organizations encouraged safer sanitation. Training programs prepared workers for new roles. Gradually, even the remaining workers shifted to updated systems. The long era of night soil collection began to come to an end. Today, when people talk about the history of sanitation, they often focus on modern inventions. But behind these systems are thousands of years of simple, steady labor. Night soil collectors played a central role in keeping towns livable. They prevented disease by removing waste before it caused harm. They worked calmly in the dark, night after night, even when others avoided them. Their work reminds us that progress often begins with basic tasks performed by ordinary people. It shows that uncomfortable jobs can have great value. It also teaches us that the world we live in today, with clean streets and reliable sanitation, grew out of long periods of slow improvement. Each step depended on someone doing steady, careful work. The story of night soil workers is not dramatic. It is quiet, slow, and simple. It is a story of people doing what needed to be done. It is a story of steady hands, strong backs, and patient routines. It is also a reminder of how much societies rely on people who handle the least pleasant tasks with calm discipline. Today, when we press a button or turn a tap and watch water drain away, it is easy to forget how different life once was. But learning about the past helps us appreciate the comfort and safety we now have. It also helps us understand the quiet dignity of those who shaped that progress in small, steady steps. As night soil work declined in many places, people slowly began to forget how common and important the job once was. But records from old towns, cities, and villages still show how deeply the work shaped daily life. In these records, we can see how towns set rules, assigned workers, and managed waste before modern systems appeared. These simple records remind us that ordinary workers carried a heavy responsibility that kept their communities functioning. In many older documents, night soil workers were listed in the same category as other essential roles. They appeared alongside water carriers, street sweepers, stable cleaners, well keepers, and other workers who looked after a town's basic needs. Even though their job involved unpleasant tasks, officials knew they could not run a healthy community without them. Because of this, many towns protected their jobs through laws. Some laws set fixed wages. Others guaranteed rotes. Some protected the workers from being removed from their positions without reason. These rules helped keep the system stable. In some towns, night soil workers lived together in certain neighborhoods. These areas were usually located near the edges of towns because workers needed to store carts, buckets, and tools in places that were easy to access at night and easy to clean. Living close together also helped them share supplies. They often helped each other repair carts or make new handles for buckets. These neighborhoods developed their own small traditions and customs based on the shared nature of their work. In such communities, children grew up understanding the job. They watched older family members preparing for work at sunset. They learned how to behave when someone returned home tired after a long night. They learned how to wash tools. They learned how to stay safe around waste. These skills were passed down quietly, without ceremony. They were simply part of daily life. Night soil collectors rarely complained about their work in public. Speaking openly about waste was considered rude or improper in many cultures. Instead, they handled the unpleasant parts of their job with calm acceptance. Even though people often avoided them, the many workers stayed patient and steady. They focused on the importance of the task rather than the discomfort that came with it. The introduction of new technologies sometimes created tension. When sewer systems began expanding, some workers worried that they would lose their jobs. They feared they would not be trained for new roles or that the community would forget about them. Officials in some regions helped workers transition. In other places, workers had to find new paths on their own. Some moved to construction jobs because they were familiar with heavy labor. Others found work maintaining sewers since they already understood sanitation better than most. As these changes happened, people slowly adjusted their routines. Streets that once needed regular cleaning became cleaner because waste no longer accumulated in the same way. Homes that once relied on buckets or outdoor containers began using toilets connected to pipes. Workers who once visited these homes each night no longer arrived after sunset. The sound of carts passing quietly through sleeping streets grew rare. The smell of waste being removed faded. Towns changed not through sudden transformation, but through slow and steady progress. In many places, night soil workers also kept simple, written notes about their routes. They recorded which households required more frequent visits. They noted which families paid on time. They kept track of which containers needed repair. These notes were practical and brief. They were not meant for public display, but when historians found some of them many years later, they provided a clear and calm picture of how methodical the workers were. Some notes described weather conditions. Rain made streets muddy and slippery. Snow made containers harder to lift. Heat made smells stronger. Workers adjusted their routines carefully depending on the weather. They chose different paths or carried different tools. Their knowledge of the town included many small details that others never needed to think about. The job also required workers to understand simple measures of safety. When they collected waste from large buildings, they learned how to lift heavy loads without injuring their backs. They learned how to work slowly when climbing steps. They learned to keep their hands steady while transferring waste from containers to carts. They knew that accidents made the job harder for everyone, so they worked with care. Night soil workers also developed a calm patience toward people. They often arrived at households when everyone was asleep, but sometimes they encountered someone awake, perhaps tending to a sick child or finishing late tasks. If someone seemed uneasy, the workers kept their distance and stayed quiet, so they would not disturb the home. They understood that most people felt embarrassed or uncomfortable discussing waste. By staying calm and respectful, the workers helped maintain peace in the household. In some cultures, People left simple offerings for night soil collectors as a sign of thanks. These offerings were not elaborate. They might be small portions of food, leftover rice, or warm tea. Workers appreciated these gestures even though they were rare. Such small acts helped them feel recognized, even if most of society looked past their contributions. One important reason people chose this job for generations was that it offered steady income. While other types of work changed with seasons or weather, waste collection was needed all year. Workers rarely faced unemployment. Their earnings might not have been high, but they were reliable. In difficult economic times, this stability was valuable. Many families depended on it for food and shelter. In places where night, soil was used as fertilizer, the income could be even more secure. Farmers returned regularly to buy waste during planting seasons. They knew exactly how much they needed to enrich their fields. This created a simple but steady trade network. Towns produced waste. Workers collected it. Farmers bought it. Crops grew. And the cycle continued season after season. Over time, people began to document sanitation more formally. Engineers wrote guides about waste removal. Health officials studied the effects of clean streets. Governments tracked disease patterns. These studies often confirmed what night soil collectors had learned through daily experience. Towns stayed healthier when waste was removed quickly and carefully. Workers who had long been overlooked finally gained recognition in official reports, even if the reports did not mention their names. As sewer systems expanded in many countries during the 20th century, sanitation became a large and organized field. Wastewater plants were built. Treatment methods improved. Scientists studied bacteria and water quality. But even in this modern world, some principles remained the same. Waste must be removed, handled carefully, and processed safely. The calm diligence of past workers helped shape these modern practices. In some museums today, small displays show the tools used by night soil collectors. A wooden bucket, a simple scoop, a metal container, a handcart with sturdy wheels. These items look plain, but each one represents years of careful work. They remind visitors how much effort was once required to keep towns clean before pipes and drains existed. Reading about this old job can help people appreciate today's systems. It can also help us understand how much depends on steady, everyday labor. Many workers around the world still handle tasks that others do not want to think about. They manage waste, maintain drains, clean public areas, and keep systems running smoothly. Their work continues to shape the comfort and safety of modern life. The history of night soil collectors shows that progress in sanitation did not come from one invention or one moment. It came from many generations of people doing difficult work with care. It came from small improvements made slowly over centuries. It came from the calm patience of workers who understood the importance of their role. Even though the job has mostly disappeared, its legacy remains in every modern sanitation system. Every pipe, drain, and treatment plant reflects a long journey that began with simple buckets and quiet workers walking through dark streets. Understanding this story can help us feel grateful for the routines we rarely notice. It can help us respect the workers of the past who made modern life possible. And it can help us remember that even the hardest everyday jobs can hold quiet importance. For many night soil workers, the most direct reason they continued the job was simple survival. In older times, many families lived with very limited choices. Work was not something people picked based on interest or comfort. It was something they picked because they needed to eat, they needed a place to sleep, and they needed steady income. Some jobs were seasonal. Some depended on weather. Some depended on the harvest. But waste collection was constant. Every day, every week, every season. Because of this, many workers accepted the job, even when they knew it was hard, smelly, and looked down upon. In many towns, the job paid slightly better than other unskilled work. This might seem surprising, but it happened because few people wanted to do it. When a job is avoided by most, the pay sometimes rises. This did not make workers wealthy, but it allowed them to keep their families fed. A small but steady income was often more valuable than a job that paid a little less and was less predictable. Families who lived near poverty depended on that reliability. Another reason workers stayed in this job was that it was passed down through families. In many cultures, people expected to take on the work their parents did. This applied to farmers, builders, weavers, and many others. Night soil collection was no different. A child who grew up helping with tools, cleaning buckets, or watching older family members prepare for night work learned the tasks naturally. By the time they reached adulthood, they already understood most of what the job required. This made it easier to continue the trade, even if it was unpleasant. In certain societies, social structure also played a strong role. Some groups were limited to certain kinds of work based on tradition or status. They were not allowed to move into other professions. Even if they wanted to try something else, they faced barriers. These could be rules set by officials, restrictions set by custom, or simple social pressure. Because of this, families remained in the same trade for many generations. When this happened, night soil work became not just a job, but part of the family's identity. People continued the work because it was the only path available to them. Another important reason was community responsibility. Even though the job was unpleasant, many workers understood that without them, people in the town would fall sick more often. They saw firsthand how waste piled up when workers were delayed. They saw how quickly smells spread. They saw the risk of disease when waste contaminated water sources. Over time, many workers developed a quiet sense of duty. They continued the job because they understood its importance. Even if the job lacked respect, the outcome of the job mattered greatly. In places where night soil was used as fertilizer, another motivation formed. The collected waste had real value. Farmers depended on it. Fields grew better crops with it. This created a clear connection between the workers and the farmers. The workers were not only removing waste from homes, they were supporting food production. This gave the job a clearer purpose. Knowing that their labor helped produce better harvests encouraged some workers to continue, even when conditions were hard. Another reason people stayed in the job was familiarity. Humans often adapt to difficult tasks if they do them every day. The first nights in the job were often the hardest. The smell, the weight, the darkness, and the social distance were overwhelming. But over time, workers adjusted. Their senses adapted. Their bodies grew stronger. Their routines became predictable. They learned the safest ways to lift heavy loads. They learned how to avoid spills. They learned how to protect their health as much as possible. As routines became comfortable, the job felt less frightening. It remained hard, but it became something they knew how to handle. Workers also valued the independence the job provided. Many night, soil collectors worked without direct supervision. They followed their routes on their own. They decided how fast to move. They solved problems as they appeared. This level of independence was uncommon for low-status professions. The many other workers had supervisors watching them all day. Night soil collectors, by contrast, spent their nights moving quietly through empty streets. This independence allowed them to work at a steady pace that suited their own rhythm. While others might have looked down on the job, workers often formed supportive communities among themselves. They understood each other's challenges. They shared advice. They helped each other solve problems. This sense of belonging can make even difficult work feel more manageable. It helped reduce loneliness and gave workers strength to continue. Despite all these reasons, the job remained one of the most disliked in history. Workers had to accept that people avoided standing too close to them. They knew that neighbors sometimes kept their distance. They knew their job was rarely thanked or praised. But they also knew that someone had to do it. When people understand that a job is needed for the safety and comfort of everyone, they may choose to keep doing it, even if others dislike it. This quiet understanding helped workers continue night after night. Another strong reason people stayed in the job was the lack of alternatives during times of economic hardship. When harvests failed, when trade slowed, or when wars disrupted daily life, many jobs disappeared, but waste continued to accumulate. Even in the worst conditions, towns needed sanitation. Night, soil workers rarely lost their jobs during these difficult times. This made the work appealing to people who needed stability in an unpredictable world. In some regions, workers were given small privileges to encourage them to remain in the job. For example, they might have been allowed to gather leftover wood from certain areas, or they might have been given small exemptions from certain taxes or fees. These benefits were not large, but they helped families survive. This practical support gave people one more reason to continue the work. The job also taught workers skills that could be used in other forms of labor. They learned how to handle heavy loads. They learned how to move safely in crowded or narrow spaces. They learned about the layout of entire towns. They learned how to maintain tools. These skills made it easier for them to transition into other jobs later in life, when sewer systems arrived. Knowing that the job built practical experience gave some workers confidence. Even though the job was often called the worst, some workers developed a small sense of pride in doing it well. Keeping the town clean required precision. Moving heavy buckets without spilling required strength. Covering long routes night after night required endurance. Workers who handled these tasks with discipline sometimes felt a quiet satisfaction. They knew that most people could not do the job. They knew that the town depended on them. This steady pride helped them continue despite the discomfort. Another reason people accepted the job was that sanitation work was seen as steady and honest labor. People who did the job might not have been respected for the task itself, but they were recognized as people who worked hard. Hard work carried meaning in many cultures. Even if the job was unpleasant, the effort it required was respected in a simple, practical way. In addition, workers continued because quitting was often not a simple option. Leaving the job meant giving up income. It meant risking hunger. It meant placing family members at risk of poverty. Because of this, many workers remained in the job even when they grew tired. They continued because they had responsibilities greater than their own comfort. Over time, some workers became so experienced that the job felt like second nature. They knew every corner of their route. They could tell which buckets were full by sound. They could predict which areas needed extra attention after heavy rain. This deep familiarity made the job feel less overwhelming. Doing something difficult becomes easier when it is practiced every day. Some workers also believed that the job helped prevent harm to others. This sense of purpose mattered. When people understand that their labor protects children, families, and neighbors from sickness, they may feel a duty to continue. Even if the town did not thank them directly, the workers saw the immediate effects of their efforts every night. For all these reasons, income, tradition, necessity, duty, stability, familiarity, independence, community, and simple survival, night soil collectors continued their work through many generations. Their job was difficult, but it was essential. Their work was unpleasant, but it protected people from sickness. Their status was low, but their contribution was high. One of the main reasons people continued as night soil collectors was simple survival. In older times, families had very few choices for work. Jobs were not picked for comfort or enjoyment. They were picked because they provided food, shelter, and a steady income. Night soil collection was one of the few jobs that people could rely on every day. Unlike seasonal farm work or unstable trade, waste was always there and had to be collected. This reliability made the job a practical choice, even if it was unpleasant. Another reason was family tradition. In many cultures, children inherited the work of their parents. They learned from an early age how to lift buckets, carry loads, and maintain tools. By the time they reached adulthood, they already knew the routines. Following in their parents' footsteps gave them a sense of purpose and security. Even though the work was difficult, it was a familiar path and often the only realistic option available. Social rules and status also played a role. In many societies, jobs connected to waste were assigned to lower status groups. People in these groups could not easily move into other professions, even if they wanted to. These restrictions meant that many families stayed in the job for generations. Even when the work was harsh and stigmatized, people continued because it was the path they had been given. Income was another powerful motivator. While the job was physically demanding and socially avoided, it provided steady pay. In some regions, night soil workers could also trade waste for goods or use it to earn extra income by selling it as fertilizer to farmers. This created a reliable way to support a household. The stability of the income often outweighed the hardships of the work. A quiet sense of responsibility kept workers going as well. They knew the town depended on them. Without their efforts, waste would pile up, streets would become unhygienic, and people could get sick. Even though the job was unpleasant and often unrecognized, night soil collectors understood that their work prevented real harm. This sense of duty gave many workers the motivation to continue night after night. Some workers also stayed because of the independence the job allowed. Unlike many other professions, night soil collectors could work at their own pace. They moved alone or with small teams and were not constantly supervised. This freedom gave them control over their work and a steady rhythm to their nights. Experience and skill played a role too. Workers became experts in handling waste safely, managing heavy loads, and navigating streets quietly at night. Their knowledge grew over years, and this mastery made the job easier to manage. They learned routines, routes, and tools that helped them endure the difficulties. Familiarity made the job less overwhelming than it might appear to outsiders. Community relationships also mattered. In some regions, farmers depended on waste as fertilizer, creating small networks of trust and trade. Families who appreciated steady income, households who left small offerings of thanks, and co-workers who supported one another all provided encouragement. Even small gestures of recognition or practical support motivated workers to continue in a job that was otherwise seen as undesirable. Ultimately, people did this job even though it was called the worst everyday job in history, because it combined necessity, security, skill, responsibility, routine, and family survival. It may have been smelly, socially stigmatized, and physically demanding, but it was essential, reliable, and in many cases the only viable option for many people. Without them, towns and villages could not function safely. Their work, though quiet and often unrecognized, laid the foundation for public health systems and sanitation practices that later generations would benefit from. So, in answer to the title question, people continued in this very difficult job because it allowed them to survive, provide for their families, protect their communities, and gain stability in a world with limited choices. It was hard, unpleasant, and often avoided by others, but it was necessary. And many workers took pride in knowing that they were keeping towns and villages safe, night after night. Thank you so much for listening to this calm story about history's hardest, everyday job. If you enjoyed this gentle, historical storytelling, please consider subscribing. And if you liked learning about these quiet heroes of the past, give this video a like. Your support helps keep stories like these coming, told slowly and clearly, perfect for relaxing or falling asleep.